everybody, this is my thoughts on Overwatch. This is the first-person shooter by Blizzard Entertainment that was released in May of this year, and it recently went on a free weekend on Battle.net, so obviously I took advantage of that and gave it a try, and thus you're getting this video, which is probably the only video I'm going to do of Overwatch other than that How to Fail video that I uploaded a couple of days ago. And the reason for that is fairly simple, actually. Pretty much everything I need to say about Overwatch can be said in this NTO. The only thing I didn't actually experience throughout the course of playing the free weekend is the competitive mode, and that's only because it wasn't available to free weekend players. You have to have leveled up to 25 to be able to actually mess around with the competitive mode at all, and even then it's basically just skill-based matchmaking when you really get down to it. The only real benefit I've seen from it is the fact that you can get golden weapon skins if you earn enough of the competitive currency, so to speak. So I'm really not bothered at all by the fact that I didn't experience the competitive mode. I did experience every other mode that's available, and I played every single character in the game in those 3 to 4 hours that I messed around with it during the free weekend. Thus I have a pretty comprehensive idea of how the game works and how it plays out in the long run, so let's go ahead and delve into the finer points of it and just examine what exactly we have here. Now, as far as presentation goes, you really have to distinguish between the actual visual quality and the art style. The art style for this game is pretty great. It's got this very nice cartoony art style that works extremely well for it, and the attention to detail that Blizzard have put into it is pretty much second to none. We're talking effectively Pixar levels of animation quality here, meaning that all of the animations in this thing are incredibly smooth, incredibly fluid, and they just look absolutely fantastic, as do all of the character designs and the map designs. They have done a fantastic job with the art direction here. But what they haven't done quite as good a job with is the actual visual quality, which despite a very extensive PC options menu giving you tons of options to mess around with and tons of ability to scale the game's performance to meet your needs, you got a game that really looks like it could have come out about 4 or 5 years ago. This has two effects. On the one hand, for people who really value visual quality, that's going to be somewhat of a letdown. In fact, it's going to be quite a big letdown. But for the rest of us who actually give a crap about performance, that's great news, because this thing runs brilliantly, and despite the visual quality not really being up to snuff with modern releases like, say, Battlefield 1, it still looks good just because the art style is so well done. It really is a testament to the idea that you don't really need super high-res textures or crazy weather effects or anything of that nature, as long as you make the visual design strong enough to compensate for that. Where things get a bit messier is in the sound design, mainly in regards to the sound effects, most of which really aren't all that great. Gun and explosion sounds in particular don't have anywhere near enough bass to them, and thus you feel like you don't have any meaty sound effects to go off of. The soundtrack really doesn't do a lot to help matters. It's not that the soundtrack is bad, it's certainly not. It's actually a rather good soundtrack, it's just that it's not particularly memorable. It's not the kind of soundtrack you can listen to outside of the confines of the game and still get the desired effect. It really is something that just fits in well with what's going on during gameplay, and really not much more than that. But where the sound improves considerably is with regards to the voice acting, where every single character has their own distinct voice and their own distinct character because of that voice. And really that's one of the game's biggest strengths, is the fact that they made the cast distinct. Every single character has their own specific voice, their own specific design in terms of visuals, and they have their own personality that really does come across, both in their lines as well as their playstyle, and in their voice acting especially. So the presentation ends up being a bit messy in some regards, but overall they've done a rather good job with it. Which brings me to my really big concerns with Overwatch, the story and the gameplay, or I should say lack of story, because there is no campaign in this, it's only a multiplayer game, and the only story you really get is that there was this group named Overwatch in the past during something called the Omnic Crisis, and they ended up being disbanded, but now the world is on the brink of chaos once again, and Overwatch basically gets called back into service to stop the chaos. At least I think that's what the plot is, because the game doesn't really tell you anything. This means that while Overwatch does have a plot, and it does have a story to some degree, it's not really told to you in the confines of the game. Instead, Blizzard is putting out these animated shorts, which are really, really good, by the way, to fill in the backstory and introduce characters as they put them into the game, and so on and so forth. The problem with that is that it means that the actual game doesn't really have a storyline. It's just, you're a bunch of heroes duking it out for dubious reasons. Which I guess is fine from a multiplayer gameplay standpoint, but the problem is that they've set up all of these characters to have their own unique backstories and abilities, and that makes you want to know more about them and learn more about how they interact with the other characters and what relationships there are, if there are any, and yet the most you really get with that is a fairly short animation that's maybe once every couple of months. It reminds me a lot of Team Fortress 2's Meet the Class videos, where it would introduce you to the class and their own personalities and things like that, but they were so few and far between and really didn't give any real storyline to what was going on in Team Fortress 2. Same kind of thing happens with Overwatch, and it means that the characters, despite being very well designed and being rather distinct in both look and sound and gameplay feel like they're all completely wasted on a game that's almost nothing but mechanics. This brings up my first major criticism with Overwatch. You've got these really well designed characters who all have different personalities and you want to know more about them, but the game doesn't tell you. So you either want a single player campaign to help flesh all that out, or what I think would actually work even better than that, a full-on animated series. I may not really like the game itself all that much, but I would absolutely watch the living hell out of an Overwatch animated series. It would be pretty much a perfect setup for that. Hell, even going back to the previous games that Blizzard's done, like StarCraft, the campaigns were really the best parts of those, and yet you get to Overwatch and it's multiplayer only and it's very bare bones in terms of what it even tells you. It's a massive missed opportunity there. And since that missed opportunity means that there's really not much to go on in terms of story here, what you end up falling back on is the gameplay, which is problematic. You see, Overwatch is part of a growing genre of games known as hero shooters, where instead of playing character classes, you're playing as a bunch of actual characters who have their own sets of abilities, and in this particular case you have 4 different categories of that: offense, defense, tank, and support. Basically standard roles for just about any game out there, really. And you take these characters and play 4 different modes: Assault, Escort, a hybrid mode, and then Control. Assault basically has one team trying to capture 2 different points on the map in sequence and the defending team trying to stop them. Escort has the defending team trying to stop the attacking team from delivering a payload to the final point on the map. The hybrid mode has the teams trying to compete over a single point on the map, and then that spawns a payload that they then have to deliver to the last point on the map against the enemy team. And then there's the control mode, where the teams compete over a single point on the map, and once they capture it, the team gains a point, and then it resets to a new round. And in that instance, you're basically going for best of 3. Then there's the arcade mode, which is a rotating variety pack, so to speak, where you have modes like a 3v3 elimination mode or 6v6 brawl mode or things like that. The kind of thing that you're not really going to be playing a massive amount of, but it's good to shake things up every once in a while. But regardless of which mode you're playing, you select a character at the beginning of the match, and then you just progress through the match normally until you decide to change up your character, which you can do much like you can do with any class in just about any other first-person shooter. The idea there is to not really have any one particular character that you're going to main. Instead, you're going to play different characters as your team needs them. So, say for example, you're filling up your team and then you don't have a healer. Well, you might want to pick Mercy or Lucio or someone like that who has healing abilities. Or maybe you've got too many offense players on your team, and so you decide to respawn as a defense player or a tank and thus even out the odds a bit. The idea is to adapt to whatever situation the game is throwing at you at any given point, so whatever the enemy team is doing, you're trying to counter that. The problem with that is that even though that's well-intentioned, the reality is that people will want to main certain characters, so you've got those people who always want to play Widowmaker or Genji, whether they're actually good with them or not, and thus they end up being a liability to their team rather than an asset, and everybody gets mad at them for it. And then you have people like me who try to fill in on some particular aspect that the team is lacking, or at least try to mitigate some of the issues that are presented by other characters that are being played on that team at any given point. The problem with that is that you end up with the jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none problem, where you're okay with a bunch of different characters, but there's no one you really excel with, and thus you're really not as much of an asset to your team as you might think you are. The problem comes in when you have certain strengths and weaknesses that are really a matter of the player rather than the characters that they're playing. For example, I am absolutely horrible at playing tank characters. I have always been terrible at playing tank characters in everything I've ever played, whether it's a first-person shooter, or a role-playing game, or a MOBA, or whatever it may well be. So basically the last thing you want me doing is having to be that guy on my team who picks a tank character because nobody else on the team did. I end up being more of a liability than an asset at that point. This means that the game is supposed to encourage teamwork and communication. The problem with that is that that's pretty much fundamentally incompatible with most gamers these days. They all want their instant gratification, they all want their game to be all about them and nobody else. Damn the consequences, and that ends up just ruining the game for everybody when that happens. Now, admittedly, this is a problem with just about any team-based game. If your team is not working together and they're not communicating well, then you're just not going to have a good time. The thing is that most other team-based games are niche enough that they are going to attract the kind of people who will do that, say Rainbow Six or Squad or anything of that nature. Overwatch is aimed at a very general casual audience more than anything else, and a general casual audience is really not the kind that is going to work really well together, and they're ultimately not going to be able to get the most out of Overwatch as a result. This of course brings up the idea of playing with your friends, but if your friends don't own Overwatch, or if they own it on console and you own it on PC, then, well, that's a problem. And that really isn't helped all that much by the learning curve, because even though the characters do have their own distinct playstyles and it's a very easy game to pick up and play, you do have to get used to the idea of having to pop your ult after a while, because that's something that if you don't play MOBAs, then you're not really going to be familiar with it. And you have to come to grips with the fact that every single character has their own specific stats for health and damage resistance and things like that. Now the nice thing about this is that there's no loadouts or rank-based unlocks or anything of that nature that are going to hinder your enjoyment of the game by making the people who played it longer just blatantly superior in every way. But it still means that the people who played it longer are just going to know how the game plays and how the characters play, and they'll be able to work around that. But at least with player skill being equal, it's a level playing field. The problem with that is that this means there's really not much nuance. You can't really take a character and play them many different ways. There's really only one specific way that they're supposed to be played, and if you deviate from that, then generally speaking you're not going to do well, or you're just going to get annihilated all the time. There's no system in place for you to mess around with your characters so that instead of just being ridiculously wimpy but being very fast, they are at least capable of taking more than basically 2 hits before dying. You're just stuck with it, because the only thing that you can unlock in this game as far as the characters are concerned is cosmetic stuff. And luckily enough, the cosmetic items do not have any actual effect on the gameplay mechanics. They're just different skins or sprays that you can put on the various walls, or different voice lines that they can say, or different hero intros when you're doing the play of the game or whatever it may well be. And while that's nice, it means that you don't really have all that much to keep you coming back in terms of the unlock side of things. This might well be fine for you, but for other people it may not be, and in fact I'm somewhere in the middle of there because I like the fact that the unlocks are only cosmetic items, but I don't like the way in which they are delivered to you. It's a system that is easily open to abuse in that it's loot boxes. You get randomized loot boxes whenever you level up, as well as whenever you complete certain tasks like getting 3 wins in the arcade mode, and whenever you open a loot box it gives you 4 items from that list of things I just said. So you have basically no control over what items you're actually unlocking at any given point. It's just randomized. You might be able to eke out enough currency through the loot box system to be able to buy the things you want through the hero gallery, but realistically you're just going to have to wait to get it in a loot box, and that's just pure luck of the draw there. You might get nothing but sprays, you might get nothing but voice lines, you might get nothing but skins. It just depends entirely on whatever situation is at hand when the dice are rolled. And in addition to this system being just downright annoying to deal with sometimes if you get nothing that you're actually interested in, but it's also open to excessive microtransaction abuse. And quite frankly, a lot of us are just sick of seeing that crap in our games these days. We don't want randomized loot, we want the things that we actually want. It's a very artificial way of dragging out the unlock progression and making it more of a grind. And it's just downright frustrating as a result. But quite frankly, the biggest problem I have with Overwatch is simply the value proposition. For $60 for the Origins Edition, which is literally just the base game with some extra cosmetic content, or $40 for the base edition, at least at the standard price, you'd better be getting a lot of bang for your buck, and what you get in this is 4 basic game modes that you've seen in other first-person shooters. You're getting a bunch of characters that, while definitely distinct in their visual and auditory designs, are still derived from other first-person shooters and MOBAs, as well as absolutely no single-player campaign whatsoever, and as far as we can see so far, absolutely no modding potential whatsoever, meaning you have to wait on Blizzard to produce all of the new content for the game whenever they end up doing that, and just trust that they aren't going to riddle the game with microtransactions, even though they said they're not going to do any sort of season pass, and thus all the major content updates are going to be free for all the owners of the game. Which I have to remind you, we only have their word on, and it's entirely possible that they'll just say, screw it, we're going to do whatever we want with this. And they would be well within their rights to do so. But even then, the fact of the matter is that the content you're getting in the game right now isn't really worth the price of admission. If it released at a price point of maybe $30 at most, then I could see it. But for $40 or $60, depending on the version you're getting, I can't see it at all. Not to mention that there are actually alternatives to Overwatch. You can play something like Paladins, and even though it's definitely not the same game at all, it's still familiar enough to give you a lot of the same experience that you get with Overwatch, but it's free. Of course, don't get me wrong, Paladins is not remotely finished. It's in fairly early beta stage, and on top of that, it's never going to have the sheer amount of polish that Overwatch is going to have forever. Because let's face it, if there's one thing I can consistently praise Blizzard on, it's polishing the living hell out of their games. But the fact remains that it's an option if you wanted to play something like Overwatch, but you didn't want to shell out $40 or $60 for Overwatch. In its current state, if it were marketed at, say, $30 or $20 especially, then it would be something that is much easier to recommend, because the value proposition would be there at that point. But here's the fact of the matter. I played this thing for about 3 or 4 hours, and it was getting incredibly dull incredibly quickly. That's not to say that the game is actually bad. It's not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that the only word I can really use to describe the gameplay feel is bland. There's just this definite sense that I get, considering I've played a lot of games over the years, that I've just been there, done that, bought the t-shirt. And while Overwatch definitely achieves a large degree of competence in its gameplay mechanics, it doesn't really seem to strive for much more than that. It's mechanically very sound, it is smooth, it is fluid, it plays extremely well, the netcode is great, but there's just this pervasive sense that the game could be a hell of a lot better than it actually is, because as it stands, it's just competent. It does what it does decently, and not really much more than that. It's polished as all hell, the art design is great, the characters are well designed, but as far as the actual gameplay mechanics go, it's just pretty average, and that's not really enough to keep me coming back to it. That's not enough to justify the cost of admission. It was on sale over the course of the free weekend for $35, and yet I just couldn't justify that price. If it were $20 or less, I might consider getting it, but the thing is, I only played this thing for about 3 or 4 hours, and already it was getting incredibly stale, so I really can't see myself playing this thing much longer than I already have. Again, it's not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination, but I just can't see any reason to recommend this over just about any other multiplayer shooter these days. Because other multiplayer shooters are branching out and doing more interesting things than this. Because Overwatch can basically just be summed up as, it's Team Fortress 2, but instead of playing classes, you're playing MOBA characters. And also the game doesn't suck. And unless you really, really like the repetition that this game is going to offer you, then you're not really going to be able to get all that much out of it in the long run. Certainly not for the asking price it is right now. If it were cheaper, if it goes on sale for a really deep discount, then I can say you might want to give it a try. Or if they have another free weekend, definitely give it a shot and see if it's your kind of thing. But ultimately, I just have an extremely hard time recommending this game over any other multiplayer shooter out there that isn't complete garbage. Which I guess speaks volumes about the current market for first-person shooters in general, but still, it's kind of depressing that a game this ridiculously hyped up is just so average. But I guess that's just a problem with Blizzard in general, because everybody seems to think they're some ridiculous messiah of gaming, much like people seem to think of Valve. But in reality, they just play it really safe and just polish the living hell out of their games, and that's pretty much it. But hey, I guess if all you want is a game that could have been so much more, then Overwatch will fit the bill there. So I hope I've made my position on Overwatch clear there, and why I'm not going to be doing a full-on review of this, but don't take that as, hey, DW hates this game. I don't hate this game at all. In fact, there's quite a few things I like about the game, but none of it is enough for me to be able to recommend it. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you all in later videos.